Well, welcome back again, everyone, to Jeff's here, talking suffering.
Talking about suffering.
Oh, what a wonderful topic.
With a good attitude.
Yeah, there are, if you had to list the top 10 topics that you wanted your pastor to preach about, suffering probably wouldn't be there. Except that.
Unless you're suffering.
That's exactly it. Unless you're suffering, and then you want to hear as much as you can.
Exactly
So
right.
hopefully this is helpful to you,
Right.
although we hope your suffering isn't too great right now. But suffering on the golf course is how we've started these conversations. And Jeff just told me that he wants to talk about when you can't keep it on the planet.
Right.
When you have no idea where it's going. I've never had that problem.
Well, I think there's been a big shift, and just talking on the teaching side of it in the last, we've talked about this, I think, at a video before this. There's been a big shift once we got TrackMan. And prior to TrackMan, anytime anybody would hit the ball to the left, they would say, well, I pulled it. And their immediate assumption was that they came over the top, got waist steep, and swiped it left because the ball was going left. And so the reaction would be trying to swing more out to the right, when in fact, and then we get TrackMan and say, no, it's much more a function of the club face than it is the path. So the ball starts on the club face and it curves based on your path relative to your club face. Mm-hmm. So if I lost you there, it's hard to follow a little bit, but you understand, very often a guy can be swinging way to the right and the ball can start way left because the club face is dead shut. And not only does it start left, it then starts hooking. So one of the big places to be able to analyze and try to understand when you're suffering in that way, look more at your face. And so if you're hitting the ball too much to the left, for that day, as a Band-Aid kind of, just open your face, and you may find it actually helpful at address. So open the face 2 or 3 degrees. So then it starts to match your path a little bit more. Or if the ball, and I'm talking about hook, if your ball's radically hooking, open your face a little bit. If you've got a big slice, the manufacturers do it for you already. They close the club face on the drivers a little bit, 2 or 3 degrees, and then you start hitting the ball straight. So there can be a club face is a lot easier task. A lot of people think they violently change between flat one time and then steep the next and over the top and then on plane. In actuality, your club path changes not very much at all. I mean, you tend to have a pattern that's fairly fixed. What changes is people's response to lies and wind and everything, and then that changes their club face and gives them, they hit it all over the planet. So a quick solution there is to check your club face at impact or address, which will help you, and that'll give you a little bit, at least help you keep it on the golf course a little bit more and not suffer as much.
I don't want to burst Jeff's bubble, but what I usually need on the golf course when it's going everywhere is not a lesson. It's some grace.
We play grace golf at links, that we definitely do.
I need somebody to understand my pain in the
Your
moment.
Your pain.
Paul wrote about that,
He
about
did.
taking his pain to God, like we saw Hannah do. Multiple times he spoke of a thorn in the flesh.
He did.
Those who look at the scriptures aren't quite sure what he meant, whether that was a physical pain or some other kind of relentless pain that was coming into his life. But he sought the Lord, said, take this from me.
Right.
Didn't happen.
Didn't happen. In fact, in chapter 11, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he starts out by saying, defending his apostleship, really, and he says, look at what I've been through, shipwrecks and beaten and thrown outside the city for dead. And he goes down through this long litany of suffering. And then in 12, he starts to shift. And again, as Jeff alludes to, in fact, early on in church history, some even thought it might have been a besetting sin that he was struggling with. Don't really know. He doesn't elaborate on it. But what he does say is that he prayed very specifically 3 times, and this is important for all of us. And the Lord then had a response. The health, wealth, and prosperity gospel tends to preach a gospel that if you have enough faith, that in some ways you kind of won't suffer. And that's a little bit maybe taking that to an extreme, but that's very much the view. That's not the view we get from Paul. Paul says, I went to the Lord 3 times, and then the Lord's response is, and catch this, my power is being perfected in you through this process that I'm allowing, this suffering. And so this gets us to the big point here, which is, can God use suffering? Not only can he, but he does use suffering to perfect us, to move us into conformity with Jesus.
Right, and we're going to talk about that conformity with Jesus in one of our later videos. Right now I want to ask you about this thing he was told, you're not going to get relief.
Correct.
That's not good news maybe to some of you. He said, what you're going to get instead is my grace. What is that grace that comes even while we still have pain? What does that look like?
Yeah, the grace is just the continued extension, even when we don't deserve it, of God's just unrelenting love. Just his compassion, his care, his concern in the midst of, obviously, as we alluded to in the last video, the mixed bags that we are. And I think God's unrelenting love in the face of even imperfect people is how I would define grace. And when we suffer, that grace is extended to us in very significant ways, even if it was, self-induced.
Can we add one other note here?
Sure.
There was a time in John 4 when Jesus had spent a lot of time in ministry, and his disciples came to him and said, my goodness, he must be hungry by now, and they wanted to offer him some lunch, basically. And he said, I have food you don't know about. And I'm reminded in that context that there are things in our lives, times in our lives when we're looking for physical relief.
Correct.
We're looking for lunch because we're hungry, which is a form of suffering, physical suffering. We're looking for the thorn in our flesh to be removed. And God says, my answer is not physical right now. My answer runs deeper than that. It's a spiritual, internal sort of answer.
Which is, what is the purpose for God for us now? Well, it's to grow his kingdom, it's to love our wives, it's to be good parents. It's all that's true. But in the end, the really purpose, the ultimate purpose of God for us being on the earth, or otherwise when we get saved, he'd just sweep us off to heaven. The ultimate purpose here is that we are spiritually transformed. And that's what Jesus is saying, is that he's trying to draw his disciples back to the spiritual reality of things as being preeminent and not to always the physical realm. They constantly misunderstood Jesus' teaching because they assumed he was talking in the physical realm, and he was using metaphors, using analogies, and trying to help them understand the spiritual through what they could see.
So the degree here, the lesson here is that God's going to give us what we really need.
Always.
Yeah.
Always.
So our suffering, we may, because of how we're suffering, we may say, I need such and such. And God's going to say, well, that would be of some help, but let me show you what will really help.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, we thank you for being with us, and we look forward to spending next time with you as well.